New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Christopher Naughton. I'm pleased to be working alongside longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove and co-host Emmy Vadnais. Quick reminder, please click on like, comment, or subscribe. It helps get this program out to a much larger audience. Well, Darryl Anka spent much of his early professional career working in the film industry. In fact, working on some films dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrials. That had all been in the realm of science fiction. Except in 1973, Darryl had had not one, but two close encounters of his own. 10 years later, he was channeling the entity known as Bashar, and today, one who speaks extensively on open, imminent contact. Darryl's latest book, based on Bashar's teachings, is The Formula, the instruction manual for living your best life. He joins me today from his home in Los Angeles. So, Darryl, welcome to New Thinking Aloud. I think this is the first time on this program, isn't it, for you?
Yes, possibly.
I know you have lost count, you're all over the universe, but Jeffrey Mishlove, who started this program on PBS many years ago, his program aired from 86 to early 2000s. I know it aired in California, and he was interviewing people like Terrence McKenna and John Mack and many others before they became, if not household names, they became quite familiar in a larger portion of the population. Not unlike Bashar in some ways. You started Bashar started channeling through you some 40 years ago, right? Yeah. Now, I know that you've told the story a number of times, and probably some people in our audience have heard it, but just if you don't mind recounting for the people who are not familiar with how Bashar, first off, your close encounter and how Bashar started coming through you.
Yeah, in 1973, I had two very, very close broad daylight UFO sightings here over LA. First time about 150 feet away. Second time only about 70 feet away. Equilateral black triangle both times. That started me investigating things about UFOs and other related subjects because I had always heard about UFOs, but when you actually physically see something like that close up and personal with witnesses with you, then it changes everything in your world because now you're seeing something that you were told doesn't exist. So that really started me doing all my research. Eventually, I came across other books in metaphysical topics in bookstores, like Edgar Cayce, Seth Speaks, channeling, other things like that. And 10 years after the sighting, I was introduced to a channel who was conducting seminars. And I went and listened, and I thought the information was very helpful. Eventually, the entity coming through that channel offered to teach a channeling class. Now, I didn't think I was going to go in to become a channel. I just didn't understand how channeling could be taught because, reading the Jane Roberts books and Edgar Cayce, it seemed like something that just sort of happened to you out of the blue. It's not something anyone went to a class to learn. So I went into the class to further my research, and it was a series of guided meditations. And you weren't necessarily expected to become a channel in the class, but the guided meditations were for the purpose of putting you in touch with more creativity, your own higher mind, whatever you wanted to use it for. But about halfway through the course, when I was in one of the guided meditations, I received what I can only, describe as a telepathic connection, like somebody just sort of shoved this encyclopedia in my head, and in an instant, a memory came back of having made an agreement with Bashar to do this in this life. I understood the UFO had been shown to me by him on purpose to get me to do the research that I needed to do so that by the time it came time to start the channeling, I would be better prepared. And the message that was in my head, along with an image of his face, was, now it's time for you to begin if this is something you still choose to do. So now all of this happened in literally a flash. It was just all there. I
Hmm.
didn't say anything to anyone, but the entity teaching the class stopped talking and turned to me and said, "There's an entity here for you right now if you're ready to begin." And I happened to glance behind me, and one of the classmates was sketching the face I had seen in my head on a piece of paper of Bashar. So it was like I instantly had two outside validations that this wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't just my imagination. So I decided to see where this would lead. I began practicing more in the class. I did well enough that the teacher asked me to co-channel the next class with him.
Mm.
A woman came to that class who wanted to do a doctoral thesis paper on the connection between psychology and channeling. So I became one of her subjects, and I would channel at her house. She would take her notes. I would channel to her friends, and word of mouth began to spread, and more friends would show up each week. We were doing this, and pretty soon we had to do it twice a week. We had to do it in two houses a week. We had to start renting auditoriums because people
Hmm.
were just growing and growing and growing by word of mouth. I started getting invited to different cities, different countries, and in a nutshell, here I am 40
And here
years
you
later.
are today.
Yeah.
What year was that, Darryl? Was it in the 1980s when you saw the UFO?
No,
Or
that
was it in
was
the 70s?
1973. And I
73.
started,
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
I took the channeling class in 1983 and started publicly channeling in 1984.
So in 1973, you see the UFO, and again, there were, there were a couple of Van Daniken and a couple of others out there, kind of loosely speaking, kind of on the periphery of culture about UFOs. But by the time 83 rolls around, now channeling is, if not popular, I mean, it's not even quote unquote popular today, but certainly you might watch an ABC report or something like that, and a Ramtha or a Lazarus or someone might come across the screen. So it wasn't totally foreign. And like you said, you started reading Jane Roberts and Edgar Cayce as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was still really only known to people who were very interested in
Hmm.
metaphysics. It
Hmm.
wasn't really, I don't think I started hearing people use the word channeling in everyday language until sometime in the 90s.
Wow. Okay.
And then they would just sort of use it, oh, I'm channeling this, I'm channeling that. And, and so it started going into the language. But now, definitely people sort of understand what you mean when you say you're channeling something.
What was your religious beliefs at that time, if any, Darryl?
I was raised as a Catholic, but I really didn't have those beliefs at the time. I had left the Catholic Church long before that when I was still, in my teens. Um, but, it was interesting because I found that in that study that woman was doing, she had like 12 or 13 different subjects, of which I was one. And I think like 80% of them were ex-Catholics.
Yeah.
So there's something about the Catholic religion that does actually allow you to open up to the concept of mystery. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of channels might actually be ex-Catholics. Not everyone, but a lot
Of
of them
course.
seem to be.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic as well, and we just interviewed Danny Sheehan over the weekend. And I'm sure you're familiar with his work with
Yeah,
UAP Disclosure. And
yeah.
here was a guy who was going to be a Jesuit priest, right? So maybe it's in our DNA of some sort. Because you think about the Catholic Church, they've opened to the highly fantastic.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
So the only things that I really kind of enjoyed when I was growing up in the Catholic Church were things like, the incense and stuff like that. But I was whole hog. I mean, I was an altar boy. I was a choir boy. I served the last Latin mass. I still remember some of the Latin, it was really drummed into
Mhm.
you. So it was very full of the idea of ritual and mystery and stuff like that. And I do think that sort of created a mindset where you're a little bit more open to
Mhm.
mysterious things happening and
Yeah.
are willing to explore them a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Mysticism. I mean, going back, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Merton, Pierre Chardin, a little bit more contemporary in the sense he was 20th century. But I don't want to, just gloss over it because I'm not saying it was a major contribution, but in some ways, I mean, Bashar loves to talk about parallel realities. In some
Mhm.
ways, don't you think every little bit of this was grooming you for this
Oh,
moment?
absolutely. I mean, when I look back at my life, there were definitely all sorts of things that were clearly preparing me to do something like this. Like one example that I've sometimes mentioned is my parents told me, now, I mean, I have to take their word for it. my parents told me that I was actually reading magazines when I was a year and a half old. I wasn't just looking at the pictures. I was able to actually read. And so looking back, I'm going, well, that makes sense in the sense that I had to have a large enough vocabulary and an understanding of the English language for Bashar to be able to use that vocabulary in the best way possible. So there were just little things like that that obviously were preparation for me to do the channeling.
So when Bashar finally does introduce themselves to you as a collective, and again, so you're kind of gearing up for it. 10 years before that, you had the UFO experience. Not that you necessarily were making a connection, right? When you went to that channeling class, there was no like, oh, I had a UFO experience.
No.
That's why I'm here. It had nothing to do, you thought, had nothing to do
No,
with the
I
other.
mean, the only connection is that it was part of my research. And, I was just interested in metaphysical concepts and how they worked and why they existed. So, one thing did lead to another, but no, seeing the UFO was the farthest thing from my mind when I went to the class. I was just all about focused on, how do you teach channeling? What is channeling? All this kind of stuff. So.
And the interesting thing, of course, again, as I mentioned, I'm a stone's throw here from Edgar Casey's Association for Research and Enlightenment. And, in my mind, he's the grandest, maybe the grandest pioneers of quote unquote channeling. But channeling takes on many different stripes, many different colors. Some people will channel one entity. Some people will, Casey said he channeled his higher self. Who and what was Bashar to you early on? Who did they say they were, or he was, they were?
The understanding of who he or they was there instantaneously. He presented himself as an extraterrestrial consciousness, connected telepathically to many other beings in a variety of ways and in a variety of dimensions. So I instantly had the sensation, especially because of the UFO, that this was an extraterrestrial energy or consciousness of some sort. And when you talk about the idea of many stripes of channeling, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, we made the documentary First Contact about how I became a channel, is to demystify the concept of channeling, because everyone channels. It's a natural altered state. When you're doing what you love to do, when you're in the zone, as people say, you go into a state in the brain called gamma, which is between 40 and 100 cycles per second of brainwave activity. That is the channeling state. So everyone has at some point in their life been in a channeling state. And then it's just a matter of how familiar you get with it, what you do with it, how you focus it. And obviously it is something that allows you to have more creativity, make more associations, synthesize information more quickly. But it also apparently is capable of connecting you to other levels of consciousness, not only your higher mind, but perhaps other beings that are capable of doing this as well telepathically. So channeling offers a wide array of experiences, but it's not a mysterious thing. It is a natural altered state that from time to time, every single person has been in probably more than once in their life.
I've always found it interesting that those people who have been most resistant to channeling of other entities or have been resistant to an Edgar Casey are sometimes in evangelical or Pentecostal churches, and they're, exhibiting glossolalia and speaking in tongues and slain in the spirit. And in some ways, there is something almost unintentional about that process. That may not be the right word, but really almost a seamless segue between the conscious and the unconscious mind.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we're learning is that, the human mind is far more flexible, and human consciousness is far more capable of connecting into different levels, different layers, tapping into different aspects of reality very easily without necessarily using mind-altering drugs. It's just a matter of getting into the right state of being. So, yeah, I think there are many expressions of it, whether people call it channeling or not. They're sort of getting into similar states, whether it's channeling or mediumship or, speaking in tongues or something along that line. It probably all boils down to pretty much the same altered state. And you're bringing through whatever is relevant for you to bring through, or whatever your belief system says that you're going to bring through. which still could be many aspects of your own consciousness, because we are, each of us, multidimensional beings. So a lot of times when people say that they're channeling another entity, sometimes it actually might be an aspect of their own consciousness, because we do have many aspects in many different levels of dimensionality.
Hmm.
And bringing your higher mind through is one of the things that's very common, especially for new channels to do. And then they can get used to that idea. They can practice with their own higher mind. And then possibly eventually, if they've made an agreement to do so, connect with another entity that is different than themselves. But yeah, again, we all have that capacity.
It was interesting for so many years in my own career, which dealt with law, legal matters, that sort of thing. The holistic health, spiritual thing was always something I did on the side. It was just a passion of mine,
Mhm.
as Bashar might say. Step number 2, I think it is, but what have you. But it was always
That's number
something.
one.
That's number 1. Okay, right. Uh, I've got to get the nomenclature down. But what was always interesting, Darryl, for decades, on in and out of radio, doing programs on spirituality, holistic health, et cetera, I never once delved into the realm of UFOs and UAPs.
Yeah.
It was almost like they were separate silos. And I think since being involved with Jeff and Emmy and others here at New Thinking Aloud, now I see it much more as a continuum. I can't not speak about UFOs or UAPs
No.
if I'm going to speak about telepathy or clairvoyance or bilocation. It to me now strikes me as a continuum.
Yes, in many ways it is. I think that, people have had those concepts separated in their mind for quite some time, which is one of the reasons why the rate at which people became familiar with Bashar took a certain pace, because I think people were far more willing at first to accept the idea that you might be channeling a disembodied spirit. For some
Mm-hmm.
reason, that was easier for people to relate to than the idea that you were actually making a telepathic connection with an extraterrestrial being. That's okay. But I think it's been one of the reasons why the pace at which people have become familiar with Bashar or other channels that are channeling extraterrestrials has sort of happened more recently in the history of channeling, rather
Mm-hmm.
than starting out that way. But yes, you're right. It is a continuum, especially because many ETs that are connected to what's going on in the transformation of Earth at this time
Mm-hmm.
are operating on a frequency level of consciousness that is actually very similar to spirit. And Bashar has talked about this extensively. And therefore, in that context, it is definitely a continuum, because even though some ETs may still be physical, they're operating at a much higher frequency, much closer to the non-physical realm. And people can, when they encounter ETs, sometimes feel like they're encountering something that is more spirit than physical, even though they might actually be engaging with a physical being. They operate on
Mm-hmm.
a very, very high frequency.
On this again, the New Thinking Aloud channel, we've had the opportunity to speak with people such as Chris Bledsoe, who you must be familiar with, certainly through the History Channel, and people like Danny Sheehan.
Mhm.
I kind of see the work that you are doing and Chris Bledsoe and Sheehan kind of being connected at the hip in many, many ways, because
Yeah.
we've already been exposed to psychic phenomena. Now to say the word psychic is not a dirty word. I remember
Right.
I would use that term many years ago, especially in professional legal circles. You don't want to go there, right?
No,
I've
no.
spoken to people at Ions, right? Dean Radin and others who have said,
Mhm.
people say, once you start working in this parapsychological realm, that's not scientific, you're going to kill your career.
Right.
And yet now, because of the barrage of things we're seeing through podcasts, through
Mhm.
different types of media, History Channel, etc., this is now starting to be even in the minds of the skeptics. I'll go to John Oliver on HBO, who's pilloried psychics left, right, and center. You're smiling, so you've probably heard his bit on that. And yet recently, he was like, "Whoa, we got to start looking at this UFO thing seriously."
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, again, different aspects of this give people something to grab onto, because the UFO phenomenon has a physical component to it. Again,
Mm-hmm.
ironically, for some people, it might be easier for them to grab onto that because there's something to see. There is
Yeah.
something to research. There's some physical evidence to these things. So it kind of now is working backwards, where let's grab onto the UFO thing, because we can actually see these things in the sky. And then we start finding out that there are psychic aspects to this, telepathic aspects to this. So some people need to work it from that direction, whereas other people came at it from the spirit direction. So yeah, they do meet in the middle.
I mean, even Carl Jung talked about ETs, back in the 1950s. I think it was the last book he read.
Mm,
And he said UFOs are real.
mm.
I brought this up to Danny Sheehan and said, hey, people like Carl Jung even said, look at it mythologically, to which Danny replied, Jung was wrong. These things are real. We have the
Yeah,
technology, we have the biology. And so
yeah.
you've been listening probably to what they've been talking about in some of these congressional hearings.
Hmm.
Strikes you all as having some veracity to it and
Oh,
maybe
absolutely.
5 or 10 steps behind.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's going to take a while for them to catch up to what's probably actually going on and what a lot of people who've had experiences involved in crash retrieval and things like that of UFOs have been involved with. Now, I mean, when I have a scale where I say, okay, look, I'm 100% absolutely UFOs exist because I've physically seen them.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the stuff I have to go by, how much research is there, how much evidence is there. And so I can only say like, well, it's 99.9% because I didn't see it myself. But things like the Roswell crash, that's 99.9. There are so many witnesses, including a member of my own family. So
Really?
it's like when you hear things like that from people that you don't expect to hear them from out of the blue, you know that something happened. You know that it's a real event. And so to me, I have to say, well, yeah, 99.999%, the Roswell crash is real. They retrieved the craft. They retrieved the bodies. There's too many people, too many witnesses, too many stories that are identical to that. And then you have to be, a little bit discerning about some of the other stories because, again, you don't want to get caught up in fantasy. You don't want to get caught up in mythology. You don't want to get caught up in people's exaggerated experiences or, things that they wish would happen that they're applying to the story. But there's just too much of it for it not to have a real core of truth. You know?
I want to talk a little bit about Bashar specifically here in just a moment. But one thing I want to run by you, because again, this is something that comes up on the programs we conduct here at NTA. One of the primary questions they want to ask, and they did this in a live stream we had with Danny Sheehan just this past weekend, is are they malevolent? Are they benefic? And I know you've had really very positive experiences, but there are those guys out there, Whitley Strieber and Bud Hopkins and Matthew
Mhm.
Roberts and others. I could probably name another 10 or 12 people who had some really baleful, horrific experiences. Now, they all
Yeah.
seemingly came through okay,
Yes.
and they seem to be doing well now. But some of those early experiences were pretty, even Chris Bledsoe, pretty horrifying.
Yes. And I think a lot of that is simply because we didn't understand what was happening. We weren't prepared. Plus, on the ET side, we may have been dealing with entities that don't think like us, don't feel like us, are coming across as something a little detached, a little cold. But, when you create analogies that we are familiar with, it becomes a little bit more understandable. For example, when you take a child who doesn't understand that you're taking them to the doctor to get a shot and they don't understand what's going on, they're terrified and it's painful when they get the shot. But you understand you're doing it for their benefit, but they're not adult enough to understand this. You have to really explain it to them. They have to grow into it. They have to understand that it's something beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of a rough analogy of what's happening here is we've made an agreement for this to happen for the benefit and evolution of humanity with these other beings that are helping us evolve in certain ways. But we don't understand that. We weren't prepared for that. And especially when it really first started becoming prevalent, we had no frame of reference. We felt out of control. And especially, again, going back to the spiritual vibrational frequency aspect of a lot of ETs, as Bashar sort of explained, when our physical bodies are exposed to a very high frequency that is something similar
Mm-hmm.
spirit, our primal brain areas translate exposure to that frequency as if we are dying, as if we're exposed to the idea that we're being annihilated. And we go into fight or flight. We go into survival mode. We go into panic because we think we're about to die, because that's the feeling of being exposed to a very high frequency that forces our energy to go to a place we're not ready to deal with, that we're not capable of integrating. So I think a lot of the fear has to do with our reaction to the vibrational frequency of being shifted into a different dimension, of being exposed to different frequencies that are truly alien to us. Other than the fact that, yes, there are certain things that are done. Again, I understand we don't remember making these agreements from spirit, but I believe we have made these agreements to participate in what people call the hybrid program. It's for our benefit ultimately. I do not really believe that there are a lot of malevolent entities or ETs dealing with us right now, or that the ones that are more benevolent are keeping them at bay, if they even do exist. I know there may be some ETs that don't necessarily relate to us emotionally in the same way that we would want them to, or the way we're used to experiencing someone who cares about us, but they're a very different species. They're a very different culture. They may relate to us in very different ways. And so I think that, as you said, once people have experienced this long enough, they do usually start seeing the more positive side of this. They do usually come through it, realizing the benefits they got out of it. And yes, I understand. I'm not, in any way, shape, or form excusing that some of these experiences were very tough for people.
Mm-hmm.
But, a crude analogy, giving birth can be painful. And I think that's what's happening here is we are experiencing the birth pains of evolution, interacting with beings that are helping to promote that evolution in ways that are just simply very foreign to us, and that we need to start understanding and wrapping our minds around so that we can deal with this on a more equal level, on our own terms, so it won't be so scary, so it won't be so painful, so that we can participate in what's going on more consciously. I think that's really kind of where we're starting to be at now.
So Bashar, among other things, seems to indicate that we are on a real tipping point of evolution. I mean, in some ways, greater than when white Europeans came here to the New World, although I guess you could, a syllogism of sort could be made.
Sure.
But we're really at that tipping point now, aren't we?
Yes, as far as he's explained it. And I think as far as you can see it, there's a lot of things we're getting out of our system, a lot of things we're putting out on the table so that we have the freedom to choose which way we want our planet to go, what kind of a reality we truly prefer to experience. And according to him, we're right at the edge of open contact with ETs, that it may seem sudden when he says, hey, you're going to have open contact within the next 5 years. That may seem very sudden to a lot of people, but he's also said there have been so many things going on in the background that we haven't been aware of that lead up to this, that it's actually when we are introduced to ETs publicly, we're going to learn about all that, and then it won't seem so odd that open contact is happening within that short period of time, or what seems to be such a short period of time.
I mean, Bashar has not gone on record. Let me step back a moment, because one of the metaphors that you have used before, Bashar has used before, and as a matter of fact, a good colleague of mine, Alan Cohn, who's written about Bashar and other channel entities. I love what he says. He said, my best teachers don't have a body. And, Bashar
does, though.
Oh, he does. Okay.
Bashar is
all right.
a physical being.
Okay.
According to him.
Got you. Got you. All right. Well, maybe he doesn't have an immediate human physical body that we can all see and appreciate. But Alan, of course, was referring to the fact that this is a channeled source. But you have used, and he has used, the whole notion that the point we're at right now, think of two trains leaving the station at, I guess, 45-degree angles. I've heard this a number of times from Bashar, and others have as well. I still think we're trying to wrap our heads around it a little bit. I've heard you on some other interviews where people are still saying, say that again. But
Yeah.
I might ask you to do that again here. Give
Sure.
us the notion of what that is and tell us about, as we depart further and further, how we may not be able to see the folks on the other train. Go ahead and describe it, if you would, for the people who haven't heard about it.
Yeah, the idea is based on the existence of parallel realities. And the idea is that we're at a point, a turning point, where we're constantly shifting to different realities. It may not seem like it, but according to Bashar, you're constantly shifting. And you're doing these shifts by agreement. So whatever you agree is real for you, is your preference, is what navigates you in the direction of the different kinds of parallel reality versions of Earth that already exist. So change, according to him, is the result of our consciousness shifting from one parallel reality to another billions of times per second. That's how we experience time, space, and change. So when you start focusing on a certain vibrational frequency, that is what is the rudder that navigates you in a certain direction through a series of parallel reality versions of Earth, billions of times a second, that are more and more and more reflective of the vibration that you contain. So when people have very divergent belief systems that are very strong and very polarized, it's like people are going in two different directions, into two different parallel reality streams. And Bashar is basically saying this is accelerating right now. And that in the years to come, we may no longer actually experience people that are now vibrationally so different from us that they will no longer exist in the world that we have chosen. They will go off into a different parallel reality. We will go off into another parallel reality. And only those people that are at least somewhat similar will be experiencing each other, but the people that are too different won't anymore. And you may wonder, well, whatever happened to so-and-so? Or they may seem to have died or just simply disappeared from your life. But basically, he's saying this is the result of what he calls the splitting prism, where you're diverging into different parallel reality versions of Earth that already exists, because everything exists all at once. Everything exists now. And for a long time, we've been agreeing that we should sort of see the same basic kind of Earth. But now we're starting to be more divergent. We're starting to realize I prefer this and I prefer that. And that's starting to create this split. So he's basically saying right now we can still see each other. We are still giving ourselves a chance to decide, do I want to believe this? Do I want to believe that? But he's saying just because we can see something that may be vibrationally incompatible with us doesn't mean we're still in that reality. We are just in a reality where we have agreed that we can still see something that's different than the reality we're in, to give us a choice to decide until the very last moment whether we want to change our mind and be like that, or whether we want to maintain the beliefs that we still have. But he's saying in the years and decades to come, that will be reinforced, will be splitting farther and farther apart, like train tracks leaving the station in opposite directions, so that eventually it will probably be more difficult and more challenging to actually go from one train to another, because they will be so far apart. The vibrational realities will be so different that you won't even know that it's possible to go to a different reality anymore, because there's a kind of inertia and momentum that builds up. Bashar has talked about the idea that in their society, they've made positive choices, or the choices that are relevant for them, for so long. There's such a momentum and an inertia behind that collectively in their society that it would actually be physically challenging for them to choose anything other than the positive reality that they experience. So he's saying that's kind of where we're heading. But right now, this is the time of choosing. This is the time of making the choice. What reality do we prefer? To talk to each other, to have discussions, to come to a consensus that allows us to move together and evolve together in a way that's beneficial for all. Because if we don't do that, then we will split apart into different realities so drastically that we won't connect to each other anymore until, we're back in spirit, until we die. And then we start deciding, okay, what do we want to do from here? So that's really what he's describing, is the existence of parallel realities, the concept that our vibration determines which realities we're navigating to, and that we have a relatively limited amount of time to make that decision and work together to figure out how do we want to experience the idea of the evolution of humanity, or do we want to choose to devolve into something that isn't necessarily beneficial for us.
Well, I guess that is indicative. The polarization we're seeing today is indicative.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always had polarization in history and even American history, obviously. Right. Although it seems that what you're suggesting, or Bashar is suggesting, is that this polarization has reached a tipping point, and now an ultimate choice of sorts needs to be made. That choice is before us, but greater than maybe in previous eons.
Yes. Yeah, because we're coming to the end of a cycle. And we're coming to the end of the cycle of forgetting who we are. We're remembering who we are. We understand we're creating our reality now. We understand there is the possibility of life out in the stars. We understand that we're connected to something greater than our physical reality. So all of these things are pushing us toward an experience of awakening that makes it very imperative that we consciously choose what we prefer, instead of what we've been doing for thousands of years, is making these unconscious choices and being confused about why things are happening the way they're happening. It's about taking ownership of the creation and responsibility of the creation of our own reality experience, and choosing what is really beneficial, not only for us, but in service to humanity.
Maybe it's as simple as the Course in Miracles, or what John Lennon said. Basically, it comes down to two choices: love versus fear. Is there something going on here? Same sort of thing.
Well, that's how, I mean, that those are the real polarities in the universe, is love and fear. And so it's a matter of really making that choice that you prefer, because that's what's going to create the feedback or the reflection of the reality that you experience in some way, shape, or form. So, yeah, absolutely. And there are many ways to get there. Like you said, there are many techniques, what Bashar calls permission slips, to give yourself permission to be more of who you are, to be more aware of what the choices are. He's called this the time of choosing. And that's our greatest power, according to him, our freedom to choose. So he's encouraging us to make the choices that, again, are more in the line of being of service to humanity, because when you serve the whole, you get served because you're part of the whole. When you serve yourself, you're kind of cutting yourself off from what the whole can do to support you. So he's basically saying, be of service to humanity, be helpful in that way, be positive, be proactive, and that way you get what you need as well, because you're part of the whole picture. So that, according to him, is the way that we navigate ourselves toward a parallel reality version of Earth in what we would consider to be the future that is more positive and beneficial for humanity as a whole.
I know Bashar doesn't really like to make or share predictions. He did. I think you've raised three of them, not in the last year or so. I think you mentioned 9/11. Bashar said that there would be some sort of terrorist attack in New York City. Also, that things would change after 2016. Right. And now what we're going into in the next, maybe the end of 2026, 2027. Why don't you delve into those a little more deeply, Darryl?
Well, yeah, in 1998, he said by the end of 2001, there would be a terrorist attack in New York. Now, the reason he doesn't make predictions is because he's basically saying, or rarely does, is saying that there's no such thing as a prediction of the future. There's a lot of probabilities. The only time he'll actually make what appears to be a prediction, and he's basically saying a prediction is not a prediction of the future, it's a prediction or a sensing of the energy that exists at the moment the prediction is made. If that doesn't change, it comes to pass. But sometimes the prediction making itself known, this is where the energy is right now, can actually render itself obsolete, because now that you know what the energy is, you can say, well, I don't prefer that, let's change that. So it doesn't mean the original prediction necessarily was wrong. It simply means it may have rendered itself obsolete by making itself known and giving you the opportunity to change the energy. Nevertheless, the few times Bashar has been willing to make a prediction is because he's saying, look, what I'm sensing is there is so much energy behind this. There's so much momentum and inertia behind this. It's very unlikely that it's going to change direction. So that's why in 1998 he said, look, It seems like by the end of 2001, you're going to have a terrorist attack in New York. And he said of the 2016 election that everything would change after that, which I think we can all agree has happened. And the latest one is, again, within 5 years from now, we would have the introduction of ETs to our society in an open way. We will have open contact. How that happens, what the style of the contact is, that's up for grabs based on what we're doing down here, what we choose to do. But he said it's pretty inevitable because that's our timeline. That's what we've agreed to. And one way or another, they're going to be introduced and be interwoven into our society. So I would suggest that we at least be open-minded enough to prepare for that possibility within the next 5 years.
I think you've also,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I think Bashar has also mentioned that that we might first be introduced to some of these notions, if they are vehicles or crafts, that they would first, if you will, be seen over the ocean, not over our heads, so to speak, almost as if an introduction of sorts to other members of society who may not be listening yet to broadcasts like this.
To give us a chance to get used to it, to get familiar with it. I mean, again, the very fact that we have these, congressional hearings, I think is also an indication that it's getting closer and closer, becoming more imminent. So yeah, there may be a variety of ways that they will sort of slowly introduce themselves to us publicly to get us used to the idea that they're definitely here. And then when we can sort of start, being okay with that, then that will take the next step. They'll introduce themselves in stages. And I think that on the first introductions, it'll be those ETs that are more like us than not. So again, it'll be more familiar so we don't freak out. I know there will always be some people who will. That's okay. But I think they're going to try to do it gently in a way that will be able to look at them and maybe even say, somebody says, okay, here's an ET. And we might even go, no, really? That looks so human. So it will be something we won't necessarily be afraid of. And then over time get introduced to more and more ETs that are less and less and less like us so that we can do this gradually. Because they don't want to do it to disrupt us. They want to do it to invite us into joining a larger galactic family that's out there, that we're part of from their point of view.
So if they hand us a book that says to serve man, it's not a cookbook, right?
Right. Not that classic episode.
Great. Yeah. A great Twilight Zone. Now, Bashar said something recently, of course, which would seem to ruffle a lot of feathers, and to the degree you're comfortable to go into it, Darryl. I know that he had said prior to the election that there were there's a lot riding on this election. And he suggested, depending on who we chose, male, female, etc. And that, I'm sure you're going to discuss that one could lead to sooner open contact. The other one could lead to, war and more baleful experiences. Break it down for us. What happened there? Because I know in Echoes of Sedona, he tried to clarify this.
I am going to I'm not going to paraphrase him. I'm going to turn people on to that session.
Gotcha.
It is important to listen to the way he describes why he said what he said, because part of it was a test to get our reaction to certain things that he would say, and an indication that when open contact occurs, it's not going to be in isolation. They're going to be involved in every aspect of our society, including politically. But I would turn people on to the transmission called Echoes of Sedona, where he explained exactly why he said what he said, how that gave them an understanding of how we would react to certain things to determine when we are or are not ready for contact or how contact should occur. So I don't want to paraphrase him. It's too detailed and too important that people hear it straight from him, the way he explained it, because he was clear about why he said what he said. So I would encourage everyone to go and listen to the Echoes of Sedona transmission, where he explains why he said what he said.
Fair enough. And again, people can find that by simply going to Bashar. Is it .org? I'm sorry, I should
.org.
know this. Yes, it is.
Bashar.org. Yeah, BASHAR.org.
Now, I've heard you say this, but I don't think I've heard Bashar say that. And you just said it a moment ago. Like, they're going to be involved in all sorts of human culture, politics, culture, etc.
Yeah.
For us who watched Star Trek many, many moons ago, that sounds like it's in contradiction to the Prime Directive. Address that, if you would.
Well, there has been a prime directive and a kind of quarantine for quite some time, but some time ago, Bashar said that's not really the case anymore. There are certain things in which they are still sort of hands off, but he's basically saying it's up to us now. They're taking their cue from us and our reactions and our actions and our belief systems as to when we're ready for contact. But they are no longer prevented from doing that. There is an agenda that does exist on a higher level that we've made an agreement to abide by from spirit. Again, most of us may not be aware of that, but they're following that agenda and they're following that timeline. So the prime directive doesn't really apply that much anymore. It's really up to us to determine that we're ready, and they're taking their cue from us. Now, the one area he has said for many, many, many years is where they would definitely intervene is if we were on the verge of having global thermonuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
They will not allow that to happen for several reasons, not the least of which is that they're basically saying, look, if you want to have a skirmish in your own backyard, that's fine. But if you're going to do something that's going to start penetrating into the different realities of your neighbors, that's not allowed. And the energy release of something like a global thermonuclear war would actually penetrate, according to them, into other dimensions and other realities. And that would not be allowed. And I think that they've demonstrated that quite clearly by the several incidents that have happened over the decades where UFOs have appeared over missile silos in different countries and the launch codes have been scrambled or erased by them. I think that's a very clear sign that it's like, no, we're not going to allow that to happen.
Yes, you're right. And that's just historical fact. I think several in Montana and in other places and in other countries, as you say. And they've seen UFOs above those facilities shortly before and after these things were shut down. So it's not that large a leap for us to say, if they want to interfere, they could interfere. Right. I just always thought we were under the rubric or the umbrella that, we need to evolve, if you will, on our own, and they don't want to get involved.
Yes. And that has been true up to a point. But I think now all bets are off. So it's really up to us to go, yes, we're ready for this. So come on down.
Right. So it's still, but as you say, what's interesting about the prime directive is it's still us saying, yes, okay, we're ready for interaction. We're ready for an integration here, which allows us to use some of the technology, the wisdom, the awareness, the consciousness.
Right.
That
their own laws do not prevent them from accepting that invitation now.
Got you. All right. So, Darryl, what your mission right now has been, because you have been everywhere in many ways, but your mission really is, and this is probably from your own heart, or perhaps Bashar has told you this directly. Your mission is to go out there and share this in a way that is credible, that is meaningful, that is real, and that people, should not be afraid of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is just, I guess the agreement I made. This is what happened to me. This is what I do because this is the way it presents itself. And the thing that's gratifying about it is, people do not have to believe that Bashar is real. I can't prove it to them at this point. If in fact, we're going to have open contact, then eventually they're going to introduce themselves to us. We'll have all the physical evidence we need of their reality, of their existence. But the most important thing, and the reason they do it this way, is it focuses on the information that comes through in the channeling. It's the information that makes a difference. It's the information that can actually change our lives. It's the information that proves that it's real in terms of how the information being delivered can actually change the way we experience reality. I get a lot of gratification of people coming back to me saying, when I finally applied Bashar's principles to my life, it made a huge difference. Things are more positive. Things are better now in my life. I understand how things work. That's why I keep doing it, is because the information works, regardless of where it's coming from. So it could be another aspect of my own consciousness. Again, I can't prove that Bashar is real, but the proof is in the information and the application of the information. In applying it in my life, it's definitely made a different change. There's more synchronicity, weird magical things start happening, things get better and better and better. It always supports me. So I know it works for me. I know it can work for other people because they've told me so. That's the most important thing to focus on, is what is the information doing? Is it empowering you? Is it allowing you to control your own reality? Is it allowing you to live a better life, to be more creative, more constructive, to be a better person? That's really the litmus test for me, is does the information improve our lives? And yes, it does.
And I know we could spend an entire hour on this alone, but again, for those people watching New Thinking Loud, and maybe they're not that familiar with some of the things that Bashar has shared, one of the more powerful things, which I alluded to earlier, were, I guess, the 5 principles of success that Bashar has shared. Could you maybe go over those and just share those? Because I found it to be helpful for my own life.
Yeah, it's what he calls the formula. And now there is actually a book that has been compiled about all this information, literally called The Formula, a gift from the future. So it's all that information from Bashar. But the basic 5 principles are to act on your passion, because passion is how our body translates a message from our soul, a message from our higher mind saying, this is the next step in your life. This is the thing to take action on, because this is the path that allows you to be mostly who you truly are. So number 1, acting on your passion. Number 2, taking it as far as you can until you can take it no further, until the excitement wanes, making sure that you're not the one dampening the excitement with fear-based beliefs, just letting it wane naturally, and then looking for the next thing that contains even just a little bit more attractiveness, curiosity, or excitement or passion than any other choice, even on a normal everyday level. Taking a walk, reading a book, talking to a friend, all of these things can be representative of something that's a little more exciting than any other choice. Just keep acting in that direction and things will snowball and carry on with a momentum. The third thing is to act on your passion with absolutely no insistence or assumption as to what the outcome should look like, because the truth is we don't really know what the ideal outcome, what the best possible outcome really needs to look like. We can sometimes guess, but it's not always the case that we absolutely know what that ideal outcome should look like. So have no insistence on what the outcome should be, no assumption about what it should be. Let life show you what the next step is. Then the fourth step is stay in a positive state no matter what manifests, even if what manifests is something you objectively don't prefer, because it's always there for a reason. And if you stay in a positive state, you'll be able to use it for a positive reason. You'll get a benefit out of it, if nothing else, on the simplest possible level. Seeing something you don't prefer that's vibrationally incompatible with you makes it clearer, by contrast, what you do prefer. And that is a positive way to use what you don't prefer. Then the fifth step is examine your belief systems, let go of the fear-based ones, let go of the ones that are negative and limiting for you. Be your true self. Give in to more positive beliefs about who you are, your worthiness, your deservability. Be someone who knows they are a part of creation. They're an aspect of creation, and act like that. So those 5 steps start a snowball of all sorts of side effects going on, where your life becomes the path of least resistance. It becomes energized in a variety of ways. Synchronicity starts to amplify and magnify. You get supported in all sorts of interesting and unusual and magical ways. And you get reflections of the things you need to work on as you're following your excitement. So those 5 steps, acting on your passion, taking it as far as you can, no insistence, no assumption on the outcome, staying in a positive state, letting go of fear-based and negative beliefs, those 5 steps change your entire world when you apply them precisely and continually and consistently in your life. It does make a huge difference.
Absolutely. I can attest to that myself. Now, for many years, you've been involved in the film industry, correct?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
are you still involved, or is this really taking up all of your time?
Well, peripherally, no, I have some involvement in it, but right now, my wife Erica and I own and operate an escape room in Los Angeles, which is
Hmm.
another form of entertainment. For those
Hmm.
that are not familiar, where you go into a series of rooms that are detailed and dressed out to look like a different reality, and you solve problems, find clues, work together, team building experiences, and things
Hmm.
like that. So it's kind of like being in a video game or being in a movie. And so I'm doing that. I have other scripts that I will be doing in the future with regard to writing, producing, and directing, but I'm also writing books. Anyone that wants to find out what I'm doing on that level can certainly go to either DarrylAnka.com, or they can go to our escape room website, boggledescaperooms.com, BOGGLED, boggledescaperooms.com. But anything that has to do with Bashar, they can certainly check it out at bashar.org.
Over the years, Bashar sounds a little different. Certainly, when he first started, the accent seemed to be really thick and heavy, but it's almost as if you've both acclimated to one another.
Absolutely. There's an integration that
Mhm.
happens. I become more like him day by day as the more I get exposed to his vibrational energy. And of course, in the beginning, I wasn't used to the energy. And the idea of what most people recognize as an accent is simply because the energy feels foreign to my brain and it translates. And also the way that they send the thoughts through that get translated into our language, there's a different emphasis, a different way in which the energy is delivered that stresses our words in different ways that make it sound like an accent. It's not actually an accent in the way we normally think of an accent. It's just the way words get stressed and pushed because of the way the energy comes through and the way it gets translated in my brain into our language that I understand, which is English. So, but yeah, there's been definitely more of a blending over the years. And therefore, in acting more like him, in being more like him, in taking on more of my energy that is closer to what his energy would be, then yes, there is less and less difference between us. I become, in a sense, my version of him as a translation device in this reality.
Well, most of our conversation today I could sum up and say it is one of hope, but at a time of great polarization and for some political disappointment and for some political ecstasy, as we go into really uncertain times on this planet and certainly in this nation, what are the keynotes of hope that you or Bashar would like to share before
I,
we part
I
company
think
today?
recently what he has said is very important for us now that we know about the splitting prism, now that we know about the parallel realities, is to do our best to work together, talk to each other, find out what our true core needs and desires and wishes really are. Because a lot of the stuff that polarizes us are real surface oriented issues. They're not really the deep seated issues. What are the deep seated issues? We need to talk to each other to find out so that we can really co create a reality that serves everybody in the most beneficial way. Because most people, even though they may say, well, I believe this because of that, and I think needs to happen because of this, are really all about the fundamental issues. I want to be heard. I want to be known. I want to be seen. I want to feel like I'm worthy. I want to deserve. I want to belong. I want to participate. I want to help. All of these things are the fundamental reasons that, because we're out of touch with our deeper selves, sort of evolve into these little surface oriented things. Well, I have to believe this political thing, or I have to believe this political thing. And it really all boils down to what are our real, true, deep seated wishes that we're trying to fulfill within ourselves. And if we talk to each other, come together, find out what's common in all of these wishes and desires we have, we won't be quite so polarized. We now know that we're going into different parallel realities, and if someone still wishes to do that, they can. No one is going to force anything on anyone. But it's very important to come together and find out if we do have enough commonality that we can move forward together into a reality that truly serves all of humanity in a very beneficial way. And that's the next step, because that's what's going to tell the ETs that we really truly are ready to join a galactic community by demonstrating that we're truly willing to work on creating harmony in our own human community as well.
Our destiny is to become part of a galactic federation.
Yes, at least for some of us. For those that really truly don't want that, they will shift into parallel reality versions of Earth where no contact occurs. But again, we have to take the time to see if it's possible that more people could experience that expansion, that thing that could benefit all of us greatly and take us to a whole new level. But we also have to know that whatever someone wants to believe, that's none of our business. And we have to let them choose what they believe is best for them and go into whatever reality they believe will serve them best. Remember that ultimately we're all infinite, eternal, and indestructible spirits. This is all, in a sense, a play on a stage, as Shakespeare said. And even though there may seem to be heroes and villains in physical reality, at the end of the day, when we're all back in spirit, we all realize we were playing a part that can help move humanity forward, that can help us learn lessons, that can help us grow as spirits and souls. And then we all just go out and have a spiritual beer and say, well, that was an interesting play.
I have so many more questions, Darryl, but we'll part for today. But we want to remind folks to go to bashar.org, check out Echoes of Sedona, as Darryl was suggesting, also the new book, The Formula. Darryl, thank you so much. We've been on the periphery of your world with New Thinking Aloud now for some time, so I'm glad we're finally able to make a connection. Deborah Lynn Katz used to work with you in L.A., and she's one of our guest hosts, and she said to please say hi because it's been 22 years since she was involved in this filmmaking group, and for the longest time you were giving her DVDs of Bashar, and she had no idea that you were the one channeling this entity. So she says a great hello to you, and so does everyone else. I hope you'll join us again, and certainly for a live stream with Jeffrey Mishlove and Emmy Vadnais. So for all of us here at New Thinking Aloud, for Emmy Vadnais, for longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove, I'm Christopher Naughton. Thank you for joining us, for you, after all, are the reason that we're here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.